When you're first getting into creative writing, the problem isn't writing the story. It's knowing which methods to choose from. You probably watched multiple videos on story structure, and every single one claims to have the secret. So what is the secret? Because they can't all be right. Or can they? What if I told you that there is no secret, and that all of these methods can be translated into one core idea? For the past 3 years, I've been working on a comic book and studying all things that have to do with story. And when I first started, I ran into this exact same problem of not really knowing where to start. And this didn't come from a lack of information. Rather, it came from an abundance of it. I had taken English classes all throughout high school and middle school, read tons of stories, watched plenty of videos, and learned all the technical terms. But when it came to actually creating the story, I didn't know what I was doing, which didn't make sense to me because I used to write stories all the time as a kid. So I started asking myself, where did that ability come from? And that's when I realized I had been learning storytelling long before I even knew what a verb was. You see, back in elementary school, I got sent out of class a lot. And if you got sent out, they would send you to another class and you were given a sheet called a reflection. This piece of paper was meant to allow you to reflect on your actions so that the next time you could learn from your mistakes and make better choices. Its structure went as follows: characters, setting, problem, and resolution. This same paper was given to us whenever we were told to write stories. But here's the key difference. We weren't creating stories out of thin air. These were situations that we had already gone through. So even as a kid, if you were to come up to me and ask me, what's the problem? I could answer that easily because I had experienced the problem. But if you were to ask me to create a problem that would drive a story, I would have no answer. And that's when it hit me. Structure is not really what I was missing. It was the lack of a core conflict. So that raises the question, what exactly is conflict? Conflict in a story is simply when something stands in the way of what someone wants. That someone is your main character. Their resistance or opposition is what creates tension and stakes, which is what drives your narrative. As Robert McKee states, nothing moves forward in a story except through conflict. And that's the point. All of these structures look different, but they're all built on the same thing. The beginning, the middle, and the end only exist because something is happening, and that something is conflict. Without it, there is no story, and without it, structure becomes meaningless. Think of story structure like a rope being pulled up and down. At first, everything is stable. Nothing is changing. Then something happens, and the tension begins to rise. Some of the most popular storytelling structures out there are Save the Cat, Dan Harmon's Story Circle, The Hero's Journey, and a Japanese method known as Kisho Tenketsu. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to compare Save the Cat and Kisho Tenketsu, since they differ the most in length and wording. We will also compare two of my favorite movies, which are Django Unchained and Happy Feet. In Save the Cat, the moment of initial conflict is called the catalyst, and Kisho Tenketsu is not explicitly labeled. However, you can still see the moment when the rope begins to rise. In Django Unchained, this moment is when Django is freed by Dr. Schultz. In Happy Feet, it's when Mumble is born. These are two completely different scenes, but both are turning points in the films. Both introduce conflict and thus move the story forward. The progression that comes after this is what leads into the climax, which is the highest point of conflict. In Save the Cat, the climax occurs around the breaking the three and the finale. In Kisho Tenketsu, it's simply called 10. Now 10 is a bit different. It's not where the final conflict is solved like in other story structures. Rather, it's where a twist occurs that changes how the ending will unfold, and it also changes how you interpret everything that came before it. But it's still the peak of the story. In Django Unchained, the climax is the shootout at Candyland. In Happy Feet, it's when Momo returns and tries to convince his colony to dance. Again, these are completely different executions, but they have the same underlying function. So we can see that both structures share key moments of conflict. But what about the parts that allow the conflict to exist and eventually end? First, there's the beginning. In Save the Cat, this is the opening image and the setup. This is where characters are introduced, the world is established, and the rules of the world are defined. Then comes the catalyst, which gives everything you just saw a purpose. In Kisho Tenketsu, the beginning is called Ki. It serves the exact same function. In Django Unchained, the beginning is extremely fast. Within minutes, we understand that Django is a slave and Schultz is a bounty hunter. And that's really it. There isn't really a slow build or an extended setup, which shows something important, which is that structure is not a strict rule, it's just a guideline. In Happy Feet, the beginning is slower. We see Mumble's parents meet, have an egg, and then his father drops him. which immediately sets up future conflict. Now the ending, in both structures, the ending is where the core conflict is solved. In Save the Cat, this is the finale and the final image. In Kisho Tenketsu, it functions the exact same way. In Django Unchained, the conflict resolves when the Django kills the slave owners and escapes with his wife. In Happy Feet, it resolves when Mumble unites the penguins and influences the humans to stop overfishing. Once again, these are two different stories with the same function, and the conflict gets resolved. Now we go to the hardest part, the middle. This is where most writers struggle, because once you know your conflict, you can imagine a beginning to that conflict, and you can also imagine an ending. But getting from one to the other, that's where the real challenge comes in. In Happy Feet, there's a shortage of fish, Mumble is an outcast, and he's blamed for the problem. At the end, he's accepted and the fish return. Coming up with that is relatively simple compared to the middle. Save the Cat breaks this into multiple steps, about 8 major steps to be exact. Kisho Tenketsu simplifies it into one section, which is called Show, or Development. But here's the key insight. They're both doing the same thing. Show is simply a reaction to the core conflict that builds up towards the climax, and after that climax, there's another reaction that leads towards the resolution. Save the Cat just breaks those reactions into small pieces. This comes in the form of many turning points, or in other words, many climaxes. As John Truby explains, a story is a sequence of actions with a beginning, middle, and end, each action driven by conflict. So whether it's one step or 8, it's still development. These many climaxes represent escalation, conflict increasing, and tension rising. In both Happy Feet and Django, the middle is a series of obstacles, decisions, and consequences, each one pushing the characters closer to the highest point of conflict. So if we simplify everything, all of these structures can be reduced to something similar. That same reflection sheet that I did when I was in elementary school. Character, setting, problem, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. If we simplify it further, it just becomes beginning, problem, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, which can be converted into Freytag's pyramid. The purpose of the reflection sheet was to solve conflict. That conflict was me acting up in class. So if that structure is driven by conflict and it can be translated into 3 storytelling structures, then one can come to the conclusion that conflict is the main driver of any story. Without it, there is no beginning, no end, no middle, and therefore no structure. So the secret to telling great stories isn't choosing the perfect structure, because they all do the same thing. They organize conflict, and many great writers have used their own methods that have worked for them. Every great story doesn't start with a method. It starts with a problem worth solving.